Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm feeling pretty honored to be hosting tonight's conversation between Michelle Cassandra Johnson and Jazmin Rogers about the release of Michelle's latest book, Finding Refuge, Heart Work for Healing Collective Grief. For folks joining an event with us for the first time, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 13-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on occupied Cherokee territory. We're a general interest bookstore, but are known for our wide selection of titles related to feminism, queerness, social movements, and radical politics. We also carry a whole bunch of books that folks might not typically expect from a radical bookstore related to religion, spirituality, and mindful well-being that folks in attendance tonight might be pretty interested to check out. Our entire catalog is available for purchase on our website. So if you haven't checked us out yet, I highly encourage that you do. And I'll drop links to the website in the chat. Firestorm is also a community event space where we host all kinds of workshops, screenings, discussions, and reading groups. But since the start of the pandemic, we've transitioned entirely to an online virtual space, and will continue hosting virtual events like the one you're attending tonight until it is otherwise safe to do so. If you're interested in staying informed about all of our upcoming events, I will also drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. And a note for those who are attending through Zoom, there will be time at the end of tonight's conversation for audience Q&A. So for anyone interested in asking a question, I'll go ahead and encourage you to submit those questions throughout the discussion by using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. And our speakers will do their best to respond. So there'll be a portion of tonight where Michelle and Jasmine are discussing with each other. And if there are questions that come up for you, just again, want to encourage you to submit your questions throughout the conversation, and then we can get to them later in the event. Well, okay, great. Like I said, tonight's event features a discussion between Michelle Cassandra Johnson and Jasmine Rogers about the release of Michelle's latest book, Finding Refuge, Heart Work for Healing Collective Grief. Michelle Cassandra Johnson is an activist, author, anti-racism consultant and trainer, intuitive healer, and yoga teacher and practitioner. Her first book, Skill in Action, Radicalizing Your Yoga Practice to Create a Just World, which we also carry, was published in 2017. Michelle teaches workshops in yoga studios and community spaces nationwide, and is on the faculty of Off the Mat into the World. Finding Refuge is an invitation to intentionally move through a journey focused on remembering your wholeness and divinity by engaging spiritual practice, meditation, reflection, movement, breathing, ritual, journaling, and connecting with others to stay grounded and take action with an open heart during heartbreaking times. It's a really beautiful book, and it's an important book, and it is a needed book. So if you haven't had the chance to pick up a copy yet, I really hope that you will. And if you already have a copy, maybe consider picking one up for a friend or someone else in your life, because it's just that kind of book. And for folks who are interested, I'll also drop a link to where you can pick it up in the chat. Michelle will be joined in conversation tonight by Jasmine Rogers, who is a Western North Carolina native who grew up visiting family in Asheville and completed yoga teacher training at Asheville Community Yoga in 2017. Following meditation studies in Nepal, she opened Asheville Iridescence Yoga at 70 South Market Street, where she specializes in creating safe containers for healing and personal development. Jasmine is also a former Firestorm Collective member, and we are beyond excited to have her back with us tonight in this capacity. So Michelle, Jasmine, thank you so much for being here tonight and taking the time to share your practice, your grief, and your truth-telling with us. It's truly an honor and a gift. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Michelle for an opening meditation.
Thank you so much, Ash, and thank you to everyone who's here, and Jasmine for being here and being willing to have a conversation about finding refuge with me, and thank you for the work you do, the powerful work you do in the world. And Ash, I love Firestorm books, and am so grateful that you all said yes to this. I love what you're up to and how you're coming in community with folks, how you're intentional about that, and the space you all have created. So I thought it would be nice to begin with a meditation just to allow us to center and to help us arrive in this space. Wherever you are, I invite you to find a way to be in your body. And that might mean moving around until you can find a space or shape your body wants to make. And you can close your eyes, you can soften your gaze, or find a grounding focal point in your space. And take a moment to arrive and bring your awareness and attention to the breath. Begin to feel your inhales and exhales. And as you bring your awareness to the breath, I invite you to deepen it and lengthen it. And as you deepen your breath, begin to presence yourself a little more with each inhale and exhale. Your breath is an indication you are alive, you are here, and we're coming into intentional space together. And since finding refuge is really about the heart and the heart work we need to do at this time, I invite you to bring your awareness and attention to the heart. You might even decide you'd like to place a hand on your heart. And as you breathe and connect with your heart, I invite you to visualize your heart beating inside you. To feel your heart as an organ, an opening, a doorway, a portal, a space holder. And notice what is present in your heart space and as your heart beats. And there may be many things moving through your heart at this time. There are many things moving through mine. And this is a moment or an opportunity to check in, to ask yourself, how is my heart? How is my heart? You could even feel the heartbeat and imagine that the heartbeat is asking you, how is your heart? How is your heart? And take a few more deep breaths here, being with your heart, the hearts of others, those who are in community with us tonight. And then as you feel ready, I invite you to gently come back into your space. Stay connected to your heart. Come back into your space and this space. Just taking a moment to reorient and ground, maybe noticing the space around you. This is another way of presencing. You can bring your awareness and attention back here. And that was good because the bark was my dog Jasper, who many of you know, and he may bark again, but he waited until the end of our meditation, which I'm grateful for. So thank you so much again for being here, and Jasmine, thank you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be in conversation with you tonight. You are definitely somebody I look up to in the yoga community, and I'm just so grateful to be a part of a collective that wants to uplift your voice and uplift your message, because as we were discussing earlier, it seems like this message couldn't have come at a more perfect time. I would like to begin tonight's discussion by reading a paragraph from your book that really resonated with me. On page 111, you say, as I gained knowledge about the various roles of bees within colonies, I was struck by how each role is for the good of the hive. Bees do not see themselves as individuals, they see themselves as an extension of the hive, a collective unit whose goal and purpose are to ensure the health of not only the hive while they are alive and part of it, but also for future generations of bees that will continue their legacy of collective care. I'm really fascinated with the concept of what we can learn about being better activists, better community members, and better social agent changers through nature. So I'm curious, what can we learn, or what do you believe we can learn from our ecosystem, from nature, and as you so beautifully talk about, what can we learn from bees in regards to collective care?
Thank you for beginning here with the bees. I could talk about them forever and ever. because they teach me so much. I actually was in a hive today. The hive's name is Witch's Brew, and they're a hive that I got this spring. And I was checking on them to see if they were building honeycomb for the winter, because bees need to have enough food to make it through winter. So I've connected with the bees today by being in their space. And what I've learned about the bees and the natural world in general, but I've watched bees more since I have 3 hives, is exactly what the paragraph says, that each bee has a role. And I think that so connects with us. Each individual has a role, and can we inhabit our role and think about the good of the hive or the collective good? And so not seeing ourselves as individuals, but as an extension of each other, including every part of the natural world and our ecosystem as well. And honeybees are really hard workers too. And one thing I really love about them that makes me think about social change work is that devotion and commitment to the hive and doing what they need to do, and actually moving through different roles throughout time and trying those different roles on to support the hive and sustain it. Even as they are working so hard to sustain the hive, there's honey and sweetness there. And what I've noticed in a lot of spaces I've been in social change spaces, is that sweetness is not centered, joy is not centered, self-care is not centered, even if we're working on a cause that's really about collective care. And I think we could learn a lot about bringing in joy and sweetness to our work, to our practice. And as we come into community and we try to change the world and make our communities thrive, and to support our communities in being well. And the other thing I would say about nature is my connection to the natural world deepened, and the introduction of Finding Refuge is about this moment of deep grief, which was in 2014. And that's when my connection with the natural world deepened. I've always been connected to the natural world, of course, because I'm nature, you're nature, we are nature. And I sought out the natural world. I would go to this mountain called Pilot Mountain, that's now near my house. I live in Winston-Salem, and I would go there a lot because the expanse of the mountain allowed me to feel embodied and grounded. And it wasn't just the mountain. I went there through all different seasons. So it was seeing the natural cycle of how things come into being and blossom, and how things die, and then they go through that process again. And also what I noticed is about the natural world, in that there's deep moments of grief, is how the natural world adapts. So how, even as we are doing so many things to harm the planet, the planet continues to try to adapt in the spirit of healing. And I think there's a lot we can learn about that. Like, what do we need to do to adapt or respond to this moment so we can heal as a collective? So not just my healing, but everyone's healing. And, you know, the natural world communicates with me all of the time. And so it's part of it slowing down enough to listen. Like today I was feeling sad this morning, and I went outside and sat and watched the bees ascend into the sky. And I have a butterfly bush, and I watched the butterflies, and I have a hummingbird feeder, and I watched the hummingbird. And I heard all of the sounds, the bug sounds, the cicadas, the crows cawing, and it was really soothing. And it was like, come back into your connection with all of these beings and take a moment to do this. And, you know, at one point this morning, I was like, and even allow the natural world to see your grief and mourn with you. So that's some of what I've learned from the natural world, and what I think we can learn as we create social change and do our activist work.
Yeah, a story that resonates with me, that I've heard other somatic therapists talk about and healers talk about, is how animals like to metabolize traumatic experiences. So if you ever see the videos of zebras shaking ferociously, after being chased by a lion. They go down to the water and they just start shaking and shaking and shaking. I think it's just one of those lessons that sometimes we let trauma get stuck in our body, and we can use movement practice to help release and break up some of that trauma. And that's just another lesson that I've been able to incorporate in my personal life as working through grief in my life. And I hope that resonates with you, and I hope other people find that. Piggybacking a little bit off of how you talk about how bees not only focus on their individual work, they also focus on the collective hive. Throughout your book, you use personal narrative to share your journey with grieving. And what ways does our experiences with personal grief reflect how we witness collective grieving manifest?
Yeah, thanks. This is a big question. And I want to say that I appreciate you bringing in somatic experience and what we can learn from animals. I mean, I have a dog, Jasper, who does that all the time. Like, something happens and he shakes it off, right? And it's to regulate the nervous system and come back into balance. And I appreciate what you named about movement and how we can engage these practices of movement. And there are many different practices to reintegrate, to ground, to balance out the nervous system again and come back into homeostasis. So as you said, the Finding Refuge has my own stories of grief that I've experienced, loss I've experienced. And it's personal to me, of course. There's a lot in Finding Refuge about my life and my story. And there's also a connection to systems and grieving in response to what systems do to us and how we're positioned in systems and how systems make us act out of integrity and move out of alignment with our values and our beliefs and what we know is right or good for the collective. And so as I think about my own experiences of grief and loss, for me, it's a challenge to actually separate those from the collective because of how I view them. For example, the first chapter in Finding Refuge is about my mother, Clara, who was sick in 2019, near death, almost transitioned, and in 2020. And so I share this story of watching my mother be very sick and almost transition, which may resonate with many people who've had a loss in their family or a loss of a parent, a caregiver, someone who was close to them, someone who helped shape them, right? That story will resonate for sure. And what is also in the storytelling of that about my mother is the grief I felt about her not being cared for by the healthcare system. And, she's a Black 78-year-old woman who's bigger bodied and has a disability. And I'm naming this because she has multiple points of oppression. And there's so many ways that I think in general, we don't care for each other. And I was watching this system like silence her, not trust her wisdom about her body, over medicate her so she wouldn't ask questions, which pushed her at certain points to act out of character because she was trying to get her needs met. And so what I would invite people to do is, if they're working with Finding Refuge or their own experiences of grief, not necessarily using Finding Refuge as a tool, then they can see where there's resonance potentially with other people with their personal experiences of grief, and also look for how are systems implicated in this in some way, or what systems am I a part of that may be causing grief and may be creating barriers for people to be well and cared for and to feel whole. So I think there's an overlap. And one of the reasons I wrote Finding Refuge in the way I did, although a lot of it was channeled through me, but I believe one reason it's written in the way it is to elevate a conversation about collective grief. Because I don't think people who experience personal loss and grief, which is everyone, necessarily have enough resources to respond to that, right? And grief is something that's so many people have been conditioned to process behind closed doors and not in community and not in relationship with other people, even though we're all grieving because we're all losing something. And I really wanted to elevate this conversation about what is the collective losing because of choices we're making, because of history we haven't reckoned with, because of policies that are being put in place. I mean, right now in real time, that are meant to restrict people and limit our ability to be free. And I really want to have that conversation. And I also want us to deepen our practice of moving through our grief and our trauma so that we don't create more trauma for others.
Yeah, I think for me, I must say, if I'm just being completely vulnerable here, that first chapter resonated with me so deeply because I've had similar experiences with my mother in the healthcare system. So in my notes here, I have a little quotation around, speaking of racist institutions, the language you use in your book is social location. Can you speak to how you define social location for yourself and for the book?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this because I use the term a lot and people may not know what it means. And I have there's a shared language section actually at the beginning of Finding Refuge for folks who may not have it, which it's at the beginning so we can like level set and people can know what I mean when I say certain things. And social location is in chapter 5. That chapter is about my grandmother. It's called Ushering Us, and she was a church usher. So it's about her really, in essence, ushering me into my role in a way, and the work I do and guiding me in a lot of ways. And it's also about her life and her devotion to something bigger and her practice of being of service. And that chapter is about ancestors and how we cultivate a deeper practice with ancestors and also think about reciprocity as we do that. And social location is really about the social group membership. So which groups are we a part of? And what I mean is, and I mentioned some identities when I spoke about my mom, what I mean is like, how does dominant culture, so a system of dominance and superiority, position us? Where does it place us based on identities it has constructed and boxes that it has constructed that we have to like move in, and there are consequences if we break out of these boxes or try to dismantle these systems of dominance, which we can see so very clearly now, even though this isn't new. And so social location is, for example, based on race, I'm Black, I'm experiencing marginalization and racism in a white supremacy culture. I'm also abled, I don't have a physical disability. Dominant culture has said, you're superior if you do not have a disability. This is not what I believe about myself. This is what culture has taught me. And it's what it says about people who are able. So that gives me power. And it gives me something beyond personal power. That's not what social location is about. It's about institutional and cultural power. So who sets the policies, who sets the practices and protocols and procedures, and who can create norms and say who is normal. I am middle class. That gives me, I'm in closer proximity to power. I am female identified and cisgender. So being a female in a patriarchal society moves me a little ways away from power, the center of power, but I'm cisgender, and that moves me a little closer than someone who is trans or non-binary, for example. So social location is where we position based on the identities we embody, and culture has everything to do with these identities and how we think of ourselves and how we think of others as well.
Yeah, I thought it was really important that you included a glossary of terms and definitions that you use throughout the book at the beginning of the book, because I think there is so much miscommunication because we oftentimes don't have shared definitions, right? Where somebody who is a little more conservative might have their own definition of racism, and we might be talking about microaggressions, and they might think that that is not actually racism. So I'm curious around this connotation of grief being such a strong and charged word in our society. Do you feel like sometimes in the culture that we currently live in that we misinterpret what is actually grief and grieving for stress?
Yes, I do. This is a really good question. And I'll say more about that in a moment. I think what's interesting to me, I'm not surprised that grief is a charged word and it brings up emotions for people, because the experience of grieving is like a deeply emotional space and process to be in and move through. And part of what I believe has happened throughout time is that our experience of being humans and having a full range of emotions and experiencing loss, just like we see in nature all of the time, this cycle, that has been, it hasn't been normalized to think about life and death, and if people believe in rebirth, right? That what we have been, many of us, conditioned to think about is we live and we die, and there's not a continuation of that. Like there's no relationship with our ancestors after they die, that people transition or dreams don't come into being, or relationships don't work. And we need to get over those things really quickly, right? And that's not how humans work. I mean, I'll just say, that's like not how we work. You know what I mean? That's not how it is. And our resistance to how we actually work, and the natural cycles that we'll experience because we're alive in human bodies, that creates more trauma and suffering for us. And so what I'm curious about is how we can get back to what I believe many of our ancestors practiced, which is being in ceremony together, grieving. When the crops died, there was some ritual or ceremony, right, that was done in response to that. When a child died in the village, there was some ceremony, ritual response to that was collective. And we've really, because of individualism, because of capitalism, because of this conditioning around purity and being constrained, right, like not showing your emotions, I feel like we've moved away from our natural experience and response, right? Which is to make space for ourselves to grieve, and to do that with others, and to normalize that we are alive and going to have many experiences of loss and grief. Like that's just going to happen. And so I think people are afraid to grieve because many times people feel like their grief will swallow them whole. And I've said many times I thought that was going to happen to me too, and it didn't swallow me whole. And you know, Grace stepped in, and Spirit and other people, right, to support me. But I'm still here, even though I've written about 8 stories, including the introduction, of deep grief and loss. And again, not just my own, but our you know, the chapter about the hive is what we're doing to the planet, right? And our relationship with nature, and the you know, way we've forgotten we are nature, as I named earlier. And so I do think that sometimes people are grieving and they're calling it stress. And what I know about my experience of stress is that sometimes I can engage resources to decrease the stress I'm feeling. And what I know about grief is that it's an ongoing process. I'm not saying it's a state of being. I am saying I'm going to grieve things and lose things for the rest of my life, because that is what it means to be in this body. And stress is not a state of being either. It's a period of time where I feel overwhelmed, where many things are happening. I mean, when my mother was sick, I was completely overwhelmed and stressed. But that wasn't going to sustain itself. Like eventually something shifted in that. But my grief around how she was treated is still very much in my heart. Like my grief around how people did not see her as a precious being, I can feel it in my body. It's like in my heart. That brokenheartedness is still present, and that feels connected to grief, different than the stress of like calling the advocate that I hired for her after community stepped in to help me do that, or not being able to communicate with her because she wasn't lucid. She was over medicated and not grounded in her body in any way. And so I think there's a difference in it, and it makes sense for us to begin to, I think, educate ourselves and look at our own experiences to differentiate between stress and grief, because what may be needed in response to stress may be different than what we might need in response to what we're grieving. And at times they may be the same. But grief is something, and this may sound strange, I feel like it's something that I'm just going to be working on and like developing this skill of doing for the rest of my life like that. But I'm not going to be like working on how to be stressed or how not to be stressed. Like that's not what I'm going to be working. I might be working on mindfulness to respond to my stress and a deep practice that will help me feel more grounded. But grief is just, I think it's part of life. And I don't necessarily think stress is, I think systems are in place and people are doing things all of the time, myself included, that create stress, that move us away from ourselves, that don't allow us to feel whole, that, as I named earlier, don't allow us to be in integrity or aligned, that don't allow us to understand our liberation is inextricably bound. So that's what I would say about stress and grief, and also to make space. Grief needs room. It needs space. And I also know that part of the fear about grieving is because of feeling like one will be swallowed whole. If they grieve is like, if there's too much space, what will happen? What will happen is that an intense amount of grief will flow through, and then there's going to be a period of respite. And then another intense experience of grief, maybe related to a loss that someone has had, is going to show up. And then it's like waves. People talk about this all the time with grief. Like it is like waves. And that's been my experience of it too. So that's what I would say about stress and grief. I'm actually interested in what you think about this, since you asked the question about stress and grief. If you want to answer, you don't have to, but I'd love to know.
Yeah, again, your book was deeply impactful for a lot of reasons. One of them being your capacity to share stories. For me, feels like the first time in a long time that I've been able to see myself in a reflection, which is also, goes to a conversation of the importance of representation, right? I see you, I see myself. And I have been guilty of oftentimes when people ask me what's going on in my personal life, and I'll just go, oh, I'm just really stressed out. I'm really busy and I'm really stressed out. And then when I give myself space to sit with what is actually going on in my life, oftentimes I am deeply grieving the loss of something, or I am feeling the collective loss that we seem to keep going and going and going through. And it kind of brings me to my next point here, around social media and its effects on collective grieving and our exposure to so much all the time. Can you speak a little bit to that? Just how do you feel social media gives space for collective grieving, but also can be something that overwhelms you with collective grieving?
This is so interesting, Jasmine, that you asked this question, because I was thinking about this earlier today when I woke up at like 4 a.m, but my clock was wrong. And so it said it was like 5:30 or something, and it wasn't. And I didn't discover that till later. But I'm saying this because I was sort of disoriented. And what I did, and I woke up from a dream that was pretty intense that I actually woke myself up from. And so what I did is I got my phone and I looked at my phone and I went on to Instagram and I started reading about Texas and how choice has basically been taken away and all of the things that are happening there with abortion rights. And I was scrolling and I thought, this is not good for my brain or my heart right now. And there's this tension because I want to know what's going on, whether that's through social media or going on the news, right, or reading the newspaper. I want to know. And so much of what is going on and shared through the news in particular is tragic. It's horrific. And so I want to know, but I also don't want to begin my day at 4 a.m. in the morning when I've woken up, right, from a dream, looking at all of the toxicity and tragic things happening. So I think in that way, people have to decide what will work for them. There are days when I have the capacity to actually do that and feel grounded. And because of some things that happened yesterday, I woke up today just feeling sad. And I was like, this is going to add to your sadness, right? This is going to make you feel worse than you do, and not as a way to bypass what's going on, but I was kind of thinking about, what do I need right now? And so I feel like this is an important question that people can ask. Do I need this? Maybe I do need it. Maybe I want to know, or do I need something different? So discernment is important. And I also think that social media is so interesting, because I was teaching a workshop this past weekend, and someone was in the workshop and shared that she posts things about her feelings. Like, she treats Instagram almost like a journal, right, or a blog in that way. And some people in social media treat it as like, my life is perfect, when really it's actually not. But it's like these snapshots of, and then people make meaning of that. But that's only one part of, and it's probably a small part of what someone's experience is, right, in their lives. So she was saying that she's gotten feedback from people when she posts about her feelings, and they're not necessarily celebratory feelings, right, or this is the good stuff going on, or let's be positive about this. They're like, this is how my heart's broken, or this is what I'm feeling. And she's gotten pushback for that, where people are like, I like it better when you post about the positive things. And I know I've heard this from other people too, and perhaps some people think that about me, and I just don't. I'm like, I'm gonna post what I post, because it's coming from me and it's my voice. And if I post it, I think it's important to put it out there. But I think that I was thinking about her, and thinking about how social media could be this space where she's sharing how she's feeling, and other people deeply resonate with that. And what is it like to be like, oh, this person's feeling this way about the world too? Me too. Versus this person's life looks perfect and mine isn't. Like, that's so very, very different. And so I think it can be both. And so I would say people want to ask, what do I need? Do I need to scroll for 30 minutes? Or do I need to read another story about this, even though I know what's going on? Do I want to share how I truly feel about this, and might that resonate with others and allow us to grieve collectively? I mean, I think social media, there's so much power that can happen through, I mean, organizing has happened through social media in so many different ways. And so much research has been done on what it actually does to the brain too. And we just need to be aware of both, I think, and find some balance in that if possible. So that's what I would say, that it is this space where we can grieve collectively. And it's also this space that might remind us of all of the loss in the world. And at times it may not be what we need. Our spirit may not need that. And finally, I would say, like, I want to know the specifics of what's going on. And in my spirit, I feel what's going on. I'm highly sensitive. I'm empathic. I'm intuitive. I know that things are completely messed up. Like, I already know that. And I want to know the specifics so I can, like, be in conversation about it, right? And I think we know, we just know, the world's on fire. I said this at the end of Skill in Action, and I've said it for years. We know the world is on fire in so many different ways. And so do we need more information about that? Sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. But what is it to, like, sense into, like, I already know things are awry. I've known this since I was a child. Like, things are off, y'all. Something's going on that we need to pay attention to. I don't know what it is. I don't know if I want to be here. Like, how did we get here? I mean, I think when we tap into our intuition and our feelings, we'll feel the planet and the effects we have on the planet. We'll feel and sense other people and notice where there's disconnection. We don't necessarily need a screen to tell us that. And at times we want that information so we can talk about it and feel the gravity of it and maybe mourn it. So I think it's complex. I think there are many, many sides to this. And I appreciate your question about it.
Yeah, it's definitely something that has been on my spirit, as well as I try to filter through my social media feeds and curate them to be a lot more healthy for my mental health. And going back to what we were talking about earlier, the correlation between admitting when one is grieving versus naming it or dismissing it as something else, I do feel like there is an element of fear around having people witness you grieve that social media kind of provides a nice soft buffer for, because you can kind of turn your grief into a meme and people will kind of chuckle even though you might actually be really, really grieving at that point in time. So I'm curious, do you have any advice on how we can transmute this social media as a collective grieving space and turn it into something real world and tangible?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. And I mean, I'd love to like be in community with people and talk about this, because I think we could innovate something and like be in a dreaming session together about this. And what comes to mind is we can do this on social media, we can also do this in person, but is how can we, through like lives or Facebook lives or sharing in that way, how can we do ritual together? Like, is there a way we can do that? Where we're offering tools to people to grieve, and we're elevating a conversation about it, and ultimately then we're providing a space for healing. Obviously, we can do this in circle in person too when it makes sense to do that. But I'm thinking it is a powerful tool and a way that people do come together, you know. And I think that's one way that we can use it to make it a space to grieve. And I also think I've seen more and more of this, actually, people writing about grief on social media too. In the last, I would say 18 months, more and more people are writing about it, talking about it, and even offering things like workshops and things about it. And I'm really happy to see this, because I think it's what we're going to need to do. Like, pretty much we've been through, I mean, I don't even know if I have words for what we've been through over the last 18 months. And many of the things we've been through are not new. They just intensified, and we're still in it, right? In so many ways. And so I think we need all the tools we can get to respond. And I think normalizing a conversation or these experiences of grief, in the sense of talking about the experiences of grief, normalizing that via social media is a way that we can also use it as a tool for healing as well. So those are two thoughts. Like, how do we do ritual and come into circle and ceremony together? Even if we're on our phones or like screens, right? How do we do that? It is possible to do that and create sacred spaces. And then how can we be more authentic about what is present for us and not dismiss, you mentioned memes, not dismiss what's going on, right? Like, you know, how is your heart? I led the meditation, asking people to connect to the heart, which I do quite frequently, because people can move through their days without ever stopping to notice the heart and what's present there and what's going on. And I'm curious to know what would happen in the world if we checked in with our hearts a little more. Like, how would we be with one another if we checked in and tuned in? So those are some thoughts about what I think we can do with social media as well. Not minimize our grief or the overwhelm, or that the world feels like too much right now, but be really honest about that. So yeah.
Thank you. No, I agree 100%. And I do think it will take more people being a little more transparent and stepping into that bravery to show the not so pretty side of things on social media. That'll fully begin to make social media feel a little more tangible and a little more holistic. Yeah. In your book, you do use a lot of personal narratives to share your experiences around grief. But one of the things that I took away from this book is, outside of the loss that you experienced of a dear friend who also lived in Asheville, North Carolina, it seems like a lot of your experiences where grief were very intertwined with systemic and systems and institutions specifically. So I'm curious, how do you feel institutions perpetuate grief in our society? And specifically, how do you feel institutions perpetuate grief for Black women? Earlier, I kind of shared that your book resonated with me off the rip, because in chapter 1, I am going through something similar with my mother in the care system, and just realizing that I don't think our institutions or even the doctors or the people who were trained in these institutions realize that they're caring for somebody's mother. And it feels like this might be a narrative that is more unique to Black female experiences with the healthcare and Black people's experiences with the police.
Yeah, one, I want to say I'm sorry you're going through what you're going through, right? Like I don't know the details, and I know enough from what you just said that that's a lot to hold. So I want to acknowledge you and that, and name that. And in particular, what you said about your mother and the system not caring for her or seeing her, right? And I imagine you can't be with her all the time, which I think that was a challenge for me when my mom was sick as well. Like I had to work and I had to do things so I could pay for things, and then I'd hop in the car and drive to Richmond and see her and argue with the doctor. So I just want to say that's a lot to move through and hold. And one thing I'll say about being a Black woman is that I feel like I got so much messaging about enduring and, being strong. And I think what resulted is that sometimes people don't see me as vulnerable. And I really am. Like when my mother was dying, right, I was devastated. And I imagine other people feel the same way, but our messaging may have been different and our conditioning may have been different, and the resources available to us as well. Because to your question and point, systems based on our social location treat us differently. So some of us are cared for and some of us aren't. And what I want to say about the healthcare system in particular is clearly we know it's under-resourced. And so when I would witness the nurses in the hospital or the CNAs in the skilled nursing facility not care for my mother, I knew they had too many patients. I knew that no one had asked about their heart that day. Like no one was checking in with them. I knew they were stressed. I knew they didn't have enough time. I knew they were tired and like they weren't being cared for. So what do we expect? And then add identity on top of that and being marginalized. And we're going to be in the situation that you're in, the situation I was in, where no one was seeing my mother as a human or a human connected to other humans, right? She was seen as a body and she took certain medications every day, and the nurse came to give those to my mother and perhaps did a few other things. So I think systems cause grief in that, in particular in healthcare, but I think this is true in education too, and many systems, in that the people who are set out or charged with caring for our people are not cared for themselves. And that's going to create a cycle. And really, at the foundation, the core, many of these systems weren't designed to take care of Black women, to take care of trans folks, to take care of our elders, right? To take care of people with disabilities. Like the systems weren't designed for that. They were designed to take care of a very small group of people. And the other piece about systems, I mean, there's a lot, but the other piece I'll say is, and we know this from COVID, is that Brown and Black folks are contracting COVID more and have throughout the entire pandemic. And I was reading an article the other day about youth and children and how Brown and Black children, there was a question and sort of concern that more Brown and Black children are going to contract COVID. And to me, that has everything to do with systemic racism. Not only the racial trauma and what manifests in the body and our risk factors, but that we will not be cared for when we interact with the healthcare system and say, this is wrong with us. We need something. Can you help us? And so I think, so many things get in the way of our care and add marginalization on that, and it's amplified, and intensified by so much, and add the messages in about being strong and enduring, and I have to do it myself. And I didn't have the message, I can't ask for help. My mother didn't condition me that way, although she's very much that way, but she didn't, somehow that didn't translate to me. I was like, I need help, y'all, with this right now, my mom. But I know many Black women receive that message of like, I can't ask for help. I've got to do it on my own. I've got to take care of everyone. Like add that to it, and it's just a mess. I mean, what do we expect? So we're not cared for, and we can't care for ourselves because we're taking care of everyone else. And in so many ways, that's how we've been conditioned. And then no one's saying, how are you? What do you need? Or we have to like train people to do that. That's been my experience. I have to be like, people, you need to check on me because it seems like I have everything together, whatever that means. And I actually need support. And so I love it when people are checking in, because that's what I think we need. And again, if we're marginalized, I think we need that even more, because there's a way that our experience has been invisibilized and we've been erased. And we're very much present here having an experience on the planet and very much want to be cared for and to have what we need to care for ourselves. Like all of this is true. So, and this is just one example, like so many systems are causing grief, which is, we can think about it as like institutional trauma and how that plays out, right? And cultural trauma and how it plays out. And if we don't ever pause to say, what happened? How did we get here? What do we actually want to do instead of what we're doing? What needs to heal? Then we'll just continue the cycle. And that's the reality. And here, look at where we are. So it really will take people interrupting these systems and practice, around pausing long enough to say, how do we want to be? I ask this all the time, like every day, 18 times. How do we want to be with each other? Because the way that many systems that you may interact with and I interact with, the way they're being with us and the way we're being with each other in response is not, I always say we're not going to survive if we keep doing this. And there are a lot of indications of that. There's a lot of evidence of that. So what do we want to do? And how do we want to be? That's what I would say.
Thank you so much for just giving such a full answer, because I imagine it might be slightly triggering to hear or to see a reflection of an experience that you have also been through. So thank you for just sending your love and your care, and thank you for answering that question with so much vulnerability and wisdom. I thought that we would end on kind of a fun question, even though you started to kind of answer my question. But going back to the concept of the hive, if Black women are the queen bees of the hive, what can our white allies do to better support us in a form of collective care and collective grieving and moving through collective grieving?
I love this, and no one has asked this question yet, like it's first time. So I love that you asked this question about us being the queen bees. And we both know, like, I want everyone to be cared for. So there's that too. But you're really asking, like, you're naming, we have different roles. And you're also asking about, based on folks who are white-bodied, their social location and proximity to power, what can they do to support our care, which will support collective care? And there are a lot of things that can be done, but what comes to mind is I work with a comrade. Her name is Kerry Kelly. She's a dear friend of mine. She's a white-bodied cis woman, organizer, activist. She's real fiery. We're both Leos, and I love her dearly. And part of what we've talked about in our relationship and in our work together, because we work leading anti-racism work or just racial equity work in spaces, wellness spaces and otherwise, other spaces that are not in the wellness realm, is that at times her role is to interrupt, to disrupt. If there are white-bodied people in the space acting up, doing stuff, that she will interrupt. Sometimes I will interrupt too. And sometimes that gives me space to step back enough to take a breath. Right. And she's very clear that her role is to disrupt the system in a different way, because her people, her lineage helped construct the system and mine didn't. Now I may be implicated and maybe colluding with the system and all of that. And I need to look at that as well, but I'm not benefiting from it in any way. And Kerry's really clear she is. And so given that, she really takes her role seriously and thinks about, well, when do I need to rest? Asking me that, like, how am I caring for myself? And because we're in deep relationship, I actually ask her these same questions all of the time because we're in community together. But I think white-bodied folks, so that we can care for ourselves, need to take a risk, need to, I've said this before, put their bodies on the line, need to figure out what their role is right now and show up, right? Like there's no more time to wait and sit back and be like, I'm gonna try to figure out we don't have time for that. I do think like discernment, being mindful, obviously I think these things are important, but we really don't have time to wait, or we don't have time to waste. Like we have to act now. So I would say for white-bodied folks and any group who's, I'll generalize it, advantaged, right, to think about how they're benefiting from the system and what that means about their responsibility to dismantling the system. That's what I would say. And you know, Black women, we hold a lot. And there's a whole history of white women participating in white supremacy, even as we may share an identity, right? That white women participating in white supremacy at our expense. And so I would also say that white women could look at that too, and how that pattern continues, and how this pattern continues to limit the liberation of Black women, and our ability to actually be in relationship across difference too. So that's what I would say. And I love the question.
Thank you so much. Deep gratitude. And I think we will be moving into the Q&A portion at this time. I didn't get through all of my questions, so I might leave one in the chat. One or two, just two, or three or four.
Yeah, Jasmine, Michelle, thank you so much for the conversation. I know I'm left just kind of feeling it over here. Like I said in the beginning, sort of the practice you shared, the grief you shared, the vulnerability you shared. It's really meaningful in this moment to see kind of examples of how to engage with these types of heavy topics, these systems that affect us all in different ways, like you've pointed out, based on social positioning. So yeah, I just feel a lot of gratitude for you both. And I've dropped in the chat here a couple times that if any folks in the audience have a question or would like to share a thought, now would be the time to do it. Jasmine, I know you said you had a few more questions, and at the same time, oh, okay, so I've got one popping up. Was that you, Jasmine? Oh, Gayatri. Great, Gayatri, who actually had an event with us last week, Gayatri Sethi, on their book Unbelonging. Just wanted to offer their deep gratitude for this conversation in the book as well. So hey, Gayatri, and thanks so much for sharing that thought. I'm wondering if in the absence of there, being any questions, I imagine folks in the audience are feeling the conversation just as much as I was. I wonder if, Michelle, you would be willing to maybe lead us in like a closing meditation after everybody now has been able to hear some of the things you all discussed, perhaps taking a moment here to sit with it and feel it would be another way to experience what you all have talked about.
Yes, I would be willing to do that for sure. And I also wanted to know, Jasmine, if there is another question you want to ask before I do that, I'm happy to answer and then guide us through a meditation, I think based on the hive mind in chapter 6. Is there something else you wanted to ask, or do you feel?
The last question I would ask, on page 97, when you speak about the ancestors, you say it is critical to ask for support and guidance from our ancestors as we meet the moment, as we position ourselves to respond to a cultural trauma. Can you share why it's important for BIPOC folk to work with our ancestors? What rituals have you found to be useful on your healing journey? And lastly, you go on to say that you cannot work with the ancestors without encountering history. Do you think this shapes how white-bodied people will experience ancestral healing?
Yes. Okay. So I'll answer the last part of your question first. One thing I want to say is that more people have been asking about ancestors in spaces I've been part of than ever before. And I think it has to do with the reckoning we're in and the history we have not fully dealt with, acknowledged, the different ways we have not healed. I think that is why people are asking. And I also think people are looking for something to ground, themselves at this time. I think people are looking for information and for wisdom that is older than them. That is what I think is coming up in spaces. And it's complicated to work with ancestors for white-bodied folks, for BIPOC folks, for biracial and mixed roots people. It's complicated. And what I have experienced in spaces with white-bodied folks is a distancing from ancestors. Not every white-bodied person, to be clear with people who are here, but a distancing, a resistance when I am leading a meditation and I'm asking people to connect with their ancestors, because there's fear there. It's sort of connected to the fear of what will come up when we grieve, and that grief will swallow us whole. It's when I learn all of this about my ancestors, or I touch into it, and how that's intertwined with the trauma of BIPOC people, for white-bodied people, how that's intertwined with the trauma BIPOC people have experienced and continue to experience, there's going to be some intense feelings that arise for white-bodied folks in that. And I get it. And there's no way we can distance from our ancestors. They're literally in our bodies. They're why we're here, And so distancing, I do not think helps us in this reckoning. Now, I do want to offer this caveat that, and I say it in chapter 5, some people talk about benevolent beings or talk about well ancestors, healthy ancestors is how I wrote about it in Finding Refuge. I don't mean that white-bodied folks or BIPOC people need to work with every ancestor, because it may not be safe to do that. It may not make any sense to do that. And there is a practice where we can ask for our well ancestors or healed ancestors to support us at this time, and not just support me. So when I call on my ancestors, I'm how can you support us at this time? Right? Because I am part of the collective, and recognize that. And that the collective can benefit from my grandmother Dorothy and her wisdom and her story, and how she shaped me in so many ways, and how she continues to show up. So I do want to just offer that people want to be mindful of working with ancestors and what they're calling in and what kind of healing they're ready to do. And for example, there's a chapter about my father, who, when he transitioned, was not a well ancestor, was not settled in any way. And just recently that shifted from what I felt from him and how he's been showing up. But just in the last month, since Finding Refuge came out, which I actually think his story in there is why the story I told about him and his experience of trauma is part of why he's showing up in a different way. I didn't anticipate that. And I think that's what's going on. That there's some healing that happened in sharing something that was kept and held secret, and caused him to create a lot of trauma for people, his beloved people in his life. So with him, when he first transitioned, I wasn't Dad, come and support me, because I knew he wasn't well. And I didn't want to take on that, because I didn't want that unsettled energy. And so that we can have boundaries around our ancestors too. And so I think it's important for us to work with them. I think it's important for BIPOC people, because I actually gain a lot of resilience from my ancestors and the reality they survived and thrived amid a white supremacy culture, and picking cotton in cotton fields, and having families split apart, and having no resources at all. They moved through that, and here I am. And so I feel it's important for me to remember them, and to do what I do in honor of them. And I get for white-bodied people that may be different, because it may be a challenge to figure out, like, how do I honor them if they created so much trauma and contributed to this white supremacy culture? What one of my teachers, Lama Rod Owen, says is that somewhere along the line, you had a healthy ancestor. Somewhere there was someone, it could be like way back when, there was someone who was resisting this, right? Who was working in a different way, showing up in a different way. And I really appreciate that. And I would also say that one way we can work with ancestors, and some of this is in chapter 5, is the elements are our ancestors as well. We are living ancestors. The tree outside is an ancestor. The little creek in the back of my yard is an ancestor, right? That's communicating with me. So if working with ancestors in your blood lineage is too much, start with the elements. And the elements are almost in every culture in some way they've been worked with. So it's also a way to be mindful of appropriation as well, because the elements guide us in so many ways, and we can work with their energies as a way of working with ancestors. And lastly, there are lots of rituals, but I have an ancestor altar. I have an altar that I change all the time, and then I have an ancestor altar. And I sit in front of it. I ask what the ancestors want. Saturday, I'm going to do a ritual because my grandmother came to me in a dream the other night, and she gave me instructions about a ritual and an offering to this oak tree that's actually over the beehives. It sort of protects them. And so I'm going to do a ritual. I'm like listening to her about what I need to gather for this ritual and how I need to honor this oak tree in the backyard. It's really powerful how she came to me in the dream. So I try to check in with the ancestors and say, you know, how do you want me to live my life? And what does reciprocity look like? And what do you need? And then I wait and I listen. And then it might come in that moment, or it may come through a dream later, or through someone else who said something that I know is from my ancestors, right? And it's just moving through them. And I would also say, right, I didn't think I would say this, but what's coming to me is also writing letters to our ancestors, and people who've transitioned, and working with that energy of communicating with them, and then seeing what comes back from writing a letter. It's a different way of making an offering, but it's what just came to me, so I thought I would mention it. And I think we're in communion with them all of the time. It's like, how do we want to commune with them though? And what kind of relationship do we want to have with them? And people have agency over that. So long answer, because I love to talk about the ancestors, but you asked a lot of questions in that one question. So I was trying to touch on all of them, and thank you for asking it. So I will lead a closing centering, and I'll invite people to find a way to be again, and you can be in the same posture you were in before, or if you'd like to move around, or even, given what we talked about earlier, shake or move the body in some way to release. I invite you to be the way you need to be right now, and to move in the way you need to move. And I invite you to come back into the breath, which is life-giving, it's generative. And take a few deep breaths here, breathing in and breathing out. And as you breathe, notice the quality of the breath. We've moved through quite a bit. Notice the quality of the breath, how it's flowing through you now. And begin to deepen and lengthen your breath in your body. So find a deeper breath. Sometimes when we're grieving, we may hold the breath, and I'm inviting you to find a deeper breath. And take a moment to notice what is present. Notice how you feel. So the breath is flowing through, and notice the emotions flowing through. And I invite you to embrace what you notice, the emotions, any sensations. Embrace whatever is present for you at this time. Now I'll invite you to come back into the heart, right? This is heart work. Come back into the heart space, the heart as an organ, a portal, a doorway, the heart as a gift. Feel your heartbeat. And remember, we're in community together. So others are here, their hearts are beating too. And this is a way of remembering we are part of a hive. Our heartbeats are connected because we are interconnected. And what might it be like for us to remember this interconnectedness, the link between our hearts and heartbeats? Take a few more deep breaths here, being with your heart, the hearts of others, feeling your heartbeat, remembering your connection, our interconnectedness, feeling the heartbeats of others in this space. May you be safe, happy, and free. May all beings everywhere be safe, happy, and free. And may our thoughts and actions contribute to that safety, happiness, and freedom for all. May our world be just. May we make space to grieve. And may we heal. Thank you so much for being here tonight, for showing up. And I hope you take care and be well. And thank you. And thanks to Jasmine for your presence and questions, and again, the work you do in the world. And Ash and Firestorm Books and Coffee, thank you for hosting me and having me here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle, for sharing your insight. And, you know, I think a practice of mine in these last 18 months has been to ask for help when I need it. And I know you mentioned that earlier. And this book, Finding Refuge, feels like it has the capacity to offer real help. So I do hope folks check it out. And Jasmine, thank you so much for creating this phenomenal container tonight with your perspective and your questions, creating this experience for us and everyone in the audience tonight. So thank you both, and hope you have a good night.
Thank you so much. Take good care.
Goodbye now.
Bye.